see this comes up correctly. Did everybody enjoy the video? I love that there was an ad for Droidcon San Francisco before Droidcon San Francisco. So if you haven't gotten around to buying tickets or registering yet, you might want to. It's going to be awesome. Android development today. I am Chet.
And I'm Romain Guy.
And we submitted a talk with a sufficiently vague title, as we always do, so that we could talk about whatever the hell we wanted to when we finally got here.
We'll figure it out as we go.
If you have any suggestions, it's actually just an improv session. So here we go. So let's talk about where some of the platform and form factor things are today on Android Wear. Platform that came along, a couple of years ago. Now we've got 4,000 apps and 1,500 watch faces. Turns out when people have a watch on, they'd like to see the time occasionally. That's nice. Android TV, lots of deals with different software manufacturers as well as hardware manufacturers, so it's coming bundled in these set-top boxes and these TVs all over the place, so that's nice for all the Android app developers. And Android Audio, we're coming bundled in cars. What a weird concept.
Auto, not audio.
Did I say audio?
How many of you have an Android-powered car? It's San Francisco. People don't own cars anymore.
I'm sorry, we meant Android Auto-powered Uber ride? Okay, how about some of the numbers involved? These numbers sort of blow my mind. So they're sort of so large, it's a little hard to get your head around it. So I wanted to try to describe it in other terms.
Fair warnings, I was reading the slides, and I think those numbers make no sense whatsoever.
No,
so
it's just because he hasn't heard my description. I think it's all going to make sense in the end. So 4,000 distinct devices, the Samsung Galaxy S7, the Nexus this, and the Nexus that. So if these were like actual residents in a city, that's basically the size of Brisbane. Or it's actually 1.5 times the size of Weed, my favorite California town name. If we actually use 4,000 in terms of length, it's actually the height of the Trans-American Tower, both up and down. Pretty impressive. Or if we sort of put it in terms of rent dollars, 4,000 would probably get you a small studio apartment in a bad neighborhood. Okay, another number, $1.4 billion. Billion? No. Billion dollar? No. 1.4 billion 30-day actives, people that are actually checking in the last month. A lot of people out there. If this was in terms of Giants fans, you could actually sell out over 33,000 games. That's a bunch. Baseball has a lot of games in a season, but not quite that many. In distance, it would be 4.5 times, like lay those devices end to end, 4.5 times around the Earth. I don't know why you would do that. And the ones over the ocean would get a little wet and might not work very well. If you put it in terms of mortgage dollars, what could you buy for that thing? You might be able to get a single-family home in San Francisco, at least in a bad neighborhood. And finally, 50 billion apps. Like, what a huge number there. So if everybody on the Earth had an Android device, they could have like 7 apps per person. Not bad. Or number of apps, like just for California residents, it'd be like 1,300 apps per person, which I'm not sure, like even on some of the larger devices, whether they'd all fit on there. In San Francisco, you could actually have 58,000 apps per person, which is, I mean, that you got to admit, that's a lot of choice on your device. Or if we put it in a different unit, if we said, well, if we had 50 billion rainy days, what could we do with that? We could recover from the California drought, partially. Okay, so what else is going on? Today we have a preview release. So how many people have downloaded the preview bits?
And installed it on their phones?
Okay, so you're adventurous, but you're not quite that adventurous. So let us talk about that a little bit today. So this is the N release, or as N stands for, in my mind, yet. Which is, of course, Russian for not yet. Or officially, the name of N. Can we have a drum roll, please? It's like a thigh roll. It's really disturbing.
You should try to make them do other things.
N preview. All right, so let's talk about the features. So there's sort of 2 ways. There's many different ways to look at the features on the phone. There's sort of the user-facing ones. What are the visuals? What's the user experience going to be like? And then there's capabilities in the N preview release, which are more targeted at capabilities of developers. Not necessarily visible to the user, but hopefully useful to you as developers. So let's go through some of the user-facing.
To be honest, we have those 2 categories because we wanted to divide up the slides between us 2 last week to get them ready, and that's the only organization that we found. So some of those features don't really belong to one category or the other. Just pretend it makes sense.
Yeah. They must know what they're doing. They're up on stage and they have a microphone. All right, so split screen. This is an interesting feature. So we could demo on a device, but instead, so I'll play some videos. It's a little easier than working through the HDMI and the webcam thing up here. So we'll sort of see how this thing happens. So you've got the recents view, the overview. You drag the apps around. Basically, you can grab one of these things, long press on the title bar, and drag it into a split screen view. And then you've got recents showing up in the other half. You drag that into place, and then you can resize things. It's important to note that as you resize these, we're getting configuration changes in the app, so they can adjust their form factor according to the new size. So all the layout stuff is kicking in a correct and good way to make sure that your app actually looks reasonable in whatever size the user has set, whether it's landscape or portrait or the size of the split screen it's being resized to along the way. So there's a little bit of API around this. This is sort of automatic behavior for apps. But your app can choose whether to opt out of this behavior or exactly what they want to do in this behavior. So you can set whether you want to not be resizable. Default for Target SDK N is going to be true, but you can opt out if you choose to.
If you opt out because your layouts are broken, fix your layouts, don't opt out.
Yeah. So there's this one line that you could have, but yeah, the better solution is somewhere else. You can also give it some parameters around what you want your default size to be and what you want your default gravity and min size to be, so you can set some parameters so that your app will look reasonable when the user is playing around with it. And then there's also some query mechanisms, so you can find out both whether you're actually in multi-window at any given time or when there is a multi-window change so that you can reconfigure your app appropriately. But a lot of it is just automatic because you're going to get a configuration change. We're going to load the resources appropriate to that new configuration. And things in general should just work because this is how Android works. But you can play with it and then set parameters the way you need to. And then you can also set this intent. So you can actually launch an activity to sort of immediately go into this split screen mode and say, I want to set up this next activity to come on the screen at the same time as the previous activity. Also in the multi-window sphere, we have picture-in-picture. So on Android TV, you have the ability to keep an activity playing a video at the same time as another activity is showing a browsing experience, so you can choose something else. A little bit of API around this, whether you support picture-in-picture or not, and then again, query and callback mechanisms to know what's actually going on with picture-in-picture mode. Drag and drop. So this is capability that we've had for a while, but it was always inside an activity. You could drag and drop text or whatever you needed to there. There was API and mechanisms for you to do that and the user to do that already. But now we're in this multi-window world. Wouldn't it be nice if you could drag things between activities? So we've enabled new API and permissions around that. So one of the problems is if you want to drag this piece of information from one activity to the other, you need permissions on both sides, right? The sharing activity, the thing the user dragged from, needs to be okay with somebody else seeing that content. And the shared to activity needs to be okay with someone dropping that content onto their activity. So that's sort of what the new API is around. So you've got information about starting a drag and drop and various constants there that work around these permissions and what's actually going on. At runtime, then you can cancel this thing. You can update the drag shadow. Not one of my favorite APIs. The word shadow, kind of different than what you probably think of. This is the representation of the object as it's being dragged around on the screen.
So it's not a shadow at all.
Yeah, it's a stretch of the metaphor. That's
one way to put it.
Problem with APIs is at some point you just run out of words, and then you need other ones.
You should start using French in the APIs.
Actually, I'll give you an API detail. So the fact that this now says drag and drop instead of, a lot of this stuff is just associated with the drag, not necessarily the drag and drop. But you find out in a backward and forward compatible API that when you add new methods that are too generic, you end up causing breakages in apps because maybe now you're actually creating something in a superclass that somebody has already defined in a subclass somewhere and as their own custom method, and maybe the parameters are different, and then you basically just broke them, binary compatibility issues. So there are these API details in a large library where, unfortunately, then you need to create a mechanism where nobody would have made the mistake of overriding this before you wrote the code. So there, a little detail you didn't actually care about.
Yeah, please stop overriding future methods. That would be great.
If you just stop writing code, people. All right, so we can see what this looks like. So here's a couple of test applications. This is Internal, right now, I don't think this is part of the SDK, but we are going to bundle something like this in an article or video or sample out there that you can play with. But it seemed like a good demonstration of various elements of this. So here's, capabilities like you already had dragging things around in the same app, but sometimes when you drag, the other activity will or will not host it, depending on permissions there. So these apps just kind of show the different dynamics there and how you can set permissions appropriately so that you get the correct actions and behaviors for the user.
Yeah, I love this feature because it makes me feel like that Android is becoming a real operating system.
One of these
it's one of many features, and there's still many to implement, but getting there. Yeah, work faster.
Okay. We're trying. Notifications. So lots of changes. There always are in notifications. One of the larger sort of surface areas to interact with users. So there's new templates, as you can see up the top. Different ways of displaying your stuff. New ways to customize that. The old stuff, of course, still works. Also bundled notifications. So now you can group these things together and see the group all at the same time and interact with individual items in that group. So a little easier way, instead of just saying, oh, I received lots of email messages and then you need to unlock the phone, you can actually interact through the notification panel directly with these groups.
It's like we have a mini operating system in the window shade now.
Makes sense. Let's see, and direct reply. So this is a feature that was already in Wear for the people that have watches. You could do a lot of direct interaction just in notifications. Now we have the same capability on other devices as well. So through various builders, I love the recurrence of the word build in all these examples here. Build. It's our equivalent of the spam song, I think. So basically you can build this remote input action, put it in the notification, and then the user has the ability to directly reply inline, making it much more powerful. They don't have to unlock the device, launch the app, go through all this stuff, when all you really want to do is send a quick reply saying, no, I don't ever want to see you again. Quick settings. So I don't know if people have played around with this yet. So we always had the ability to set some sort of small atomic actions for the surface that we wanted to propagate through this UI. Now you have the ability to customize that experience to some extent and also interact with it as a developer. So not only can you turn on the flashlight, but you can also change where that is in the UI, or you could remove that completely and put something else in its place. So let's see, do we play the UI? Yeah. All right, so you can move things around to get the UI that you really want as a user. And you can also opt into it at the developer level. So through the tile and the tile service APIs, you can interact with the system to say, I have a small atomic action that the user can take. It's important to understand that these are really supposed to be small atomic actions like enabling the flashlight, not launch my APK and do a bunch of stuff, right? So there's very careful user experience that we're trying to control around here. And some of the details are also evolving. So there are approaches to it in the current preview. These could be some of the things that change in current previews. That's why we do previews, as we continue to iterate on things and get feedback from developers. Display size. So we already had the ability to boost the font size for accessibility purposes. If people with aging eyes want to read larger text on their screen, we can already do that. But that wasn't necessarily the full experience that people wanted, because it leaves all the other UI elements the same size they always were. Chances are, if your eyes are failing, maybe your fingers are getting larger as well. And
wait, what?
It's a thing. It's a thing.
No, this is not normal. You should see someone.
My doctor said I'm fine. So we enabled a much more full-featured and flexible system where we actually boost the entire display size by basically controlling the density through this display size option in settings. You can change this, and this will propagate changes to the entire UI basically by telling the device they are now at a different density level. And this causes a configuration change, so you can get both smaller and larger up to certain increments. It's not completely free-form, because at some point apps are going to break down because they're not expecting to go, zoom out to 1,000 times. It's not really the intention of this feature. But you can play with it within certain constraints that allows the users to get the feature they really need, which is give me the UI at a larger or smaller size according to what they want.
And something important for you guys, you can see that the range of zoom is such as you can completely rely on the framework doing automatic scaling for you. So if a bitmap is scaled by 1.45x, it's going to look good, especially on the high density displays today. So you don't have to worry too much about supplying like all your resources in all the different densities. Just test your app, but it should just work.
Avoid the PX dimension because that is not aware of screen density, so it's not going to behave correctly with this system. And also ensure that your app actually behaves well with the SW320DP setting, because that's sort of the default thing that we scale from. So as long as you look reasonable there, then things should just work. Trademark. So make sure you work there and also adjust your sizes or provide other resources if you want to customize how you look at other densities as well. Let's see. Oh, and then I just show the UI. So it's a similar UI to how you boost the text size, but you can see it boosts the entire UI as well. And there's a little example of this here. So if we pop up the quick settings that we were looking at before, so the default you get looks something like this, at least it does on my preview device. And then if you change the font size, so I changed it to have large text or largest text. And you can see, yes, the font size changed, all the text is larger, but nothing else on the screen changed. Right? So some layouts will adjust because the size of the text string changed, but otherwise it's basically the same size as you had before, whereas if you set largest setting on the new screen display size, then you can see all the UI elements got extra padding according to this new density mode that they're in. Multi-Locale, this has been an ongoing feature request for years. For the people that speak more than one language outside this country, I think that's how it works, pretty much. They can now select multiple languages and they can order their preferences. So maybe their native language is Chinese, but they also speak English, and so they don't want to be prompted constantly, do you want me to translate this page for you? Because they're perfectly comfortable in English. It's just that they were locked into a single language on the device. Now they have the option to tell the device that they have multiple languages they understand and to order them appropriately, so the default will always be correct, but there are reasonable fallbacks for common situations. We also added several new languages as well as new language variants, various dialects of languages as well. So you've got Belgian French versus French? What do you call it in France?
It's called French.
French.
Well, actually it's called Français, but you get the...
I don't understand that word.
Yeah, I know you don't.
Could you translate that into English for me? Okay, so we can see how this works a little bit. So you're in the settings here. You go into the language and input settings. Mine is set to American English, and then I can go in and I can add Deutsch here. So I add Deutsch,
the Liechtenstein
and I pop
version.
that in. Liechtenstein is one of my favorite countries I've never been to. And then it comes in by default at the end, and I change it to be in front, and then immediately changed my default language to German and popped up a dialogue that I did not understand. It reminded me of traveling in Germany, and I knew just enough German, mainly around numbers, to go into a store and order what I wanted, and I spoke just enough German and looked just Germanic enough that they assumed that I could actually speak German, and then they would follow this up with a question that I couldn't answer, and I didn't even know how to say, I have no idea what you're saying. So
you look stupid.
Yeah. That's just sort of a general comment, so thanks for that.
You went there.
Doze mode. So we already had this. We've been working hard on battery and power issues on the device. You may have noticed this. So we came out with the doze feature in Marshmallow, which I think you can see clearly in this graph. Doesn't this make sense to everybody? Romain said, I was looking at this picture last night. I had no idea what it was supposed to be telling me. Okay,
well,
so
it gets more confusing when you see the second picture.
Here, we'll preview it. There it is. Look at that, huh? Isn't that nice? Okay, but we'll get there. I just want to build tension. All right, so Marshmallow looks like this. Let's see if I can walk through here. So you're using your device in this left-hand section, and we're checking in, we're doing stuff all the time, in the background, on the network, whatever. And then your screen goes off, and you set it down on a table. So it's stationary, it's on battery, so it's not plugged in, and the screen is off. So after some amount of time, then we go into doze mode. And in doze mode, we no longer allow all this background activity to happen. We're not going to allow you to do network syncing, except for certain periods of time. So then a little bit later, we wake up, and it's a sync point where apps are allowed to wake up and do things if they need to, so that you can still get messages and emails and whatever while it's in doze mode, but not all the time, just at these intervals. And maybe that interval lengthens over time, so you have some sort of back-off time that lengthens over time. So That way, if it's sitting there stationary, screen off, on battery overnight, it can go into this deep sleep mode and really not wake up very often, which is going to give you better battery life, substantially better battery life over time. So now in N.
Hey, I just realized something. The green bars are higher in this slide. I don't know what they mean, but
they're higher.
Yeah, right. Look. See the green bars?
It means that I stole the images from someone else and didn't really think.
So clearly it's better because there's more green.
Yeah. All right.
And we all
Is this clear to everybody? Can we move on? All right. So in the new doze mode, we still have what we had before. All that stationary stuff works exactly as it did before, but we also have this lighter mode of doze where we can make certain decisions based on whether we think you're actually using the device. So it may not be sitting on the desk during the day, but it may be in your pocket while you're walking around. Screen is off. It's clear that the user is not actually using it at the time. Wouldn't it be nice if we weren't draining the battery at the same time because background applications continue to do all this heavy syncing when the user is not checking it for, an hour or two at a time.
And actually, that's the reason we created the Nexus 6P. It's so big that you're going to take it out of your pocket and put it on the desk, and the battery is going to be better.
It's all part of the plan. All right, so we have this similar situation where we're syncing all the time, we're doing all this activity, and then the user turns the screen off, puts it in their pocket. We continue to do this for some amount of time. And then we say, okay, it's clear, screen hasn't been on for a while. We could go into this lighter doze mode. So we're going to back off for some amount of time and then wake up occasionally and allow you to do stuff. So the amount of stuff that we back off on is smaller than the full doze mode. If it's stationary, on battery, screen off, we know nothing's going on and we can back off of all activity. In this lighter doze mode, we actually want to wake up a little more frequently to sync stuff because the phone is moving around and it's clear the user is going to want information, and we also allow a higher level of activity to happen anyway. So it is a lighter mode, but we basically have a similar concept of this maintenance window. We will wake up occasionally, allow the apps to wake up and do the things they would normally do. But in the meantime, we're saving a lot of battery in these higher green bar states. All right, make sense now? Beautiful pictures, beautiful.
So is that the part where they will be mad at us?
That's coming up. Okay. So along the lines of also saving activity, saving battery, saving power, not draining devices much, we looked at some of the things that were causing issues and contortions in the device and in app life cycles. And a lot of them were coming from intents that we would send out, and people would register for these pieces of information, and then they would wake up and do stuff. Like, user takes a picture, and 98 apps wake up and go, wait, there's a new picture here. Do I need to do anything?
It's barely an exaggeration. It's very surprising how many apps start whenever you take a picture.
Yeah.
And most of the time for no reason whatsoever.
Yeah, it's apps that, yes, they may incorporate photography or pictures or images somewhere in their app, but that doesn't mean that they needed to know when you took a picture. They probably needed to know if you took a picture during the flow of their using their application. So we said no more, right? This can't happen anymore because this is one of the big causes of battery drain. It's not just that your app was doing this, it's that everybody else's app was as well, and it's that everybody's waking up at the same time. Well, given the limited amount of resources we have on the phone, that means that a bunch of apps are going to wake up, and then as more apps keep waking up, we're going to start killing apps in the background just to make room for the new ones that are waking up. And basically the system is thrashing for a long period of time, just starting up these apps that all they want to do is wake up and go, don't care.
Yeah, a big culprit was also the connectivity one when you change network. I remember like a few months ago I was biking in the hills somewhere around here, and you keep losing network because you go from 2G to 3G to LTE to nothing. And that was enough to kill the music that was playing on my phone. I mean, my phone was not doing anything else but playing music, and there was so much activity on the device that it killed the only app that was actually running. So that was bad, and we took action.
So maybe the music app should have opted into that same information so that it could automatically restart when it was...
Oh, that would be awesome. You would lose the music every few seconds and you would start over.
There are differing levels of what we allow here. The connectivity action, basically you cannot get this anymore in the background. You need to be in the foreground to interact with that. And the video and pictures, they're just gone. You're not going to be able to send those or receive those anymore. The new approach is to use Job Scheduler, which we've been flogging for a while now as the way to batch and sync your information. GCM Network Manager is the compatible way to do that on earlier releases prior to when Job Scheduler is introduced. There's new facilities there to allow you to sync the kinds of information you were interested in before, like, hey, is there new information about pictures and videos since the last time I synced, that kind of stuff. So please look those up and change your apps accordingly. Data saver. So it's clear that a lot of people are on networks where either the data network is not available very prevalently, or that it costs so much money that they're not on it very often. They're on these metered plans that are really expensive, especially relative to the cost of the phone that they're using. So we gave the user more options for restricting the amount of data transactions that were happening. So if they do this, then your app probably wants to know about it. So they can go into settings, they can say, I want to restrict this access, so I'm on this data saver mode, and here's the information about the apps that I have and which apps are allowed unrestricted access versus restricted access. So I want my email, but I don't want this other app to have unrestricted access. So your app can now query and find out information when both the user has gone into this data saver mode as well as whether your app in particular is being restricted. So we've got a little bit of API here, so you can query the connectivity manager and say, first of all, am I on a metered network? That's kind of the first most important information. Is this costing the user right now? And if it is, then let's query the background state and find out what's going on. And there are these three states that you can be in. They can say, yes, you're enabled, but go ahead and let me get this correct here. So data saver is enabled, which means that when you're in the background, you have no data access whatsoever, so you should behave appropriately. When you're in the foreground, you have permission to use data, but obviously they're on a metered network and they're interested in data saving, so you should take it easy anyway. If your app is whitelisted, that means that they have allowed you to have access, even though they're in data saver mode on metered network, you're allowed to do things, but you should be aware that they're in this mode and you should take it easy anyway. And then finally, status disabled means that they're not in this data saver mode, so they haven't actually made that toggle, but again, they're still on a metered network. So again, you should try to save data for them anyway. And yeah, more APIs. And can we go into direct boot?
So direct boot is one, it's a feature that hopefully you won't be needing very often, but I think it's pretty much my favorite feature in N. So if you encrypt your device and you have a PIN code or pattern to start the device, one of the issues we have is that sometimes your phone reboots. It shouldn't, but it will. And then it sits on that lock screen for security at the beginning of the boot forever, draining the battery, and more importantly, not running the OS. So you cannot get your phone calls, you cannot get your text messages, and it can be pretty annoying if you were to receive an emergency phone call in the middle of the night, and you won't get it because of that reboot. So direct boot is about improving startup time, but also giving applications limited functionality while we are booting. So the idea is that apps have now access to a new type of storage, so it's file-based encryption, and your apps can register to be usable during direct boot. So by default, things like the SMS application or the phone application will have those permissions. So what this means is the phone reboots, then it's stuck on the lock screen, but as you can see, it's a lock screen with a real wallpaper. It's not the old lock screen that you saw at the beginning of the boot that was on a black background. And while the phone is in that mode, you can still receive your phone calls, receive your SMS, and the user can take action. So the way it works is, first you have to register your application as being encryption aware. You need a spatial intent filter because you need to know when the locked boot is completed so you can get out of that special mode. And like I mentioned before, you need to use that new storage space, so the file encryption-based storage. So the way it works is you need to create a special context, so you can call context.create device encrypted storage context, and then you can do your usual I/O operations on it. Now, once the user is past the special direct boot mode, the application will run in normal mode, and so you might want to migrate your data from this special storage space to the regular storage space. So on the context class, we have two new methods called migrate. They start with it's migrate something from and migrate something to, and you can use them to transfer data between the two types of storage. So when you receive the action user unlocked broadcast event, you can migrate the data from that special storage to the regular storage and then continue normally. Now, if you want to test this in your application, it's a little involved. There are two ways you can do it. You can either go to the developer options, and you have to convert your device to be file encryption enabled. And this will wipe your data. So if you have put N on your personal device, be careful. Maybe you don't want to do that. And there's a different way of doing it. You can emulate direct boot. So it will emulate file-based encryption, so you won't have all the security features, but you will be able to at least write your code and make sure the application behaves correctly. Another big feature for users is scope directory access. So a lot of applications, when they want to write something in the what used to be the SD card storage, for instance, to access the pictures folders or the music folder, they had to request access to all the external storage for read and or write. And this is a little annoying for you guys because when a user sees this, it's a very scary permission because suddenly the app is accessing read and write for the whole world. So now instead, you can request permission for very specific folders. So this is what the UI looks like as a user. You're asked if you want to allow the application to access the pictures folder and only that folder. And this is the code you can use to request that. So you go through the storage manager and you create an access intent for a very specific directory. So here, environment, the directory picture. The only trick is that you probably want to take a persistable URI permission, so you don't have to ask access every time the application runs. There's a lot of documentation in the, on d.android.com about this.
Vector drawables are cool, but sometimes don't go as fast as you want them to. In particular, if they're really complicated, if there's complicated paths involved, the amount of work that we were going through to actually just parse that data coming in, especially when it's spit out by these automated tools that have all kinds of information they embed in these. It looked like a simple curve on the screen, but it ended up being a lot of floating point numbers. So we sped it up through a combination of mechanisms. And
what were those mechanisms?
Mechanisms included, so we did move a lot of code to native. It tended to be a bit more efficient for some of the parsing information as well as just optimized data structures and approaches along the way. So a combination of mechanisms. But we got some fairly big numbers out of it, both in terms of load time and parsing the path data, and also that first draw time got a lot faster, just rendering the initial path into the bitmap where it's then cached, as well as the path morphing, which is then used in the animated vector drawable. So nice speed boost, specifically on N preview. People that are tuned into support library stuff will know that support library offers vector drawable in 23.2, I think. But that is still that's still the old approach. So this required changes to the rendering engine, which means that it's only on the N preview. But it does mean that if you're using vector drawables, you should see a performance boost.
Yeah, and also because this involves a native code, you probably don't want to have to deal with different APIs and different native libraries in your application if you're just using the support library. So on to developer-specific features. So the first one, a change in the runtime. So we used to have Dalvik that was first interpreted, then we went to a JIT, then there was ART with ahead-of-time compilation. So now ART is changing a little bit. So the system applications are still compiled ahead of time, but there is a difference for your applications. You might have noticed that when you install an update on your phone, there's this, after boot, you see this dialog, the system is optimizing the application, so it's compiling them, and it takes pretty much forever. And even when you install an application, if your application has a lot of code, the install part of the process can take a lot of time. So to fix that, there's two new things. So first of all, the interpreter in ART is a lot faster, which is going to benefit you when you're debugging, because when you're in debug mode, you'll run through the interpreter. And ART now also uses JIT. So instead of compiling the whole application ahead of time, we're going to JIT it, kind of like in the old days. But the big difference is that the JIT, some parts of your code will be JITted, then cached on disk. So you can think of it as a partial ahead-of-time compilation. And it's particularly important with the new dose mode, because when you're in those maintenance windows that we trigger regularly in dose mode, we won't run the JIT at all. It will be either interpreted or use the ahead-of-time compiled version of your application, which will save battery when we're doing maintenance.
So I think what we really did was we just changed the meaning of the acronym. AOT used to mean ahead of time, now it means all of the time.
And so again, shouldn't change anything for your application, but who knows? Well, when you change things like the VM or the runtime or whatever, like what could go wrong, right?
Confidence, that's what we want to exude.
Yeah, and those are the times when we talk about those changes, because they're also all those things we change without telling you. Java 8 language features that have been widely requested. They're finally here with some caveats, so we're going to look at them. So first of all, you need a new Jack toolchain. I don't know if many of you have used the new Jack NGL compiler, but basically instead of going through Java-C from the JDK and compiling to .class and then running DX to compile the .class into a DEX format, there's only one tool, Jack, that goes from your Java source file to an intermediate format to DEX. So it's faster because it involves only one process instead of a couple, and it enables more optimizations because everything's part of the same toolchain. So this is how you can enable the Jack toolchain and request the Java 8 features, language features in your Gradle build file. And the features that you might want to use, so first of all, we have Lambdas, and they're backward compatible all the way back to Gingerbread, because you can thank the art team.
No, they can thank us.
Yeah, that's true. Because we talk about it.
Yeah.
Be aware, however, that for compatibility, they are implemented as anonymous classes. So there is, most of the time, 99.999% of the time, it won't matter, but you are instantiating a new class every time you use a Lambda. For those of you who are not familiar with the Lambda syntax, how many of you have not used Lambdas? Wow, you guys are amazing, or lying. So there are different syntax, there are different ways to use Lambdas. There's the first one, so here we call sort on an array. It takes 2 vertex instances, and you can see an expression inside. And you can shorten Lambdas in different ways.
So one of the things about it's basically syntactic sugar around anonymous inner classes. So if you look at the API surface of the end preview, we're not using Lambdas anywhere. We're not requiring them anywhere because that would basically be requiring you to have this sort of under the hood thing where everything gets bloated into an anonymous inner class.
A good takeaway is any interface with a single method can be replaced by a Lambda. So a non-click listener, a runnable, instead of having to create your own class and implement the interface and all that stuff, you can just use a Lambda instead. One thing, however, so Lambdas work with any type of API, and they're very often used in the desktop and server world with the stream APIs from Java 8. Android does not have the stream APIs as of N. So we have the new java.util.functions package that gives you a lot of interesting things you can do with Lambdas, but you do not get the streams. Default and static interface methods, so those are not backward compatible. And you can see a couple of examples here. So we have an interface called Renderable. Let's say we had a draw method, and then we want to add a new method. And it's usually very difficult with interfaces because you break, any class that implements the interface, suddenly there's a new method they're not implementing. So you can provide a default implementation of that method. You can also have static methods, like at the bottom, static int get max texture size on your interface. And it's particularly useful when you want to create an adapter kind of class. So very often what we do is, when we have a listener with multiple callback methods, we do tend to provide an abstract class, and all it does is implement the interface with empty methods so that when you only want to implement one of the methods, you don't have to, implement all the empty methods yourself. So this is not needed anymore with the default implementations on interfaces. You can provide that default empty method.
We stopped using interfaces in our APIs for the most part because of this reason, because inevitably you would say, well, the interface will only ever have this. And then 2 releases later, you realize, oh, you know what I really want is another callback.
Now you can use them again.
Right.
So this one, I'm sure most of you will love it, because as I understand, modern Java programming language development is all about writing annotations and not code anymore. And so now you have repeatable annotation. So you probably don't care because it's not backward compatible. So in 2 years from now, you'll start using them. But so there's a new annotation, add repeatable, that you put on your annotation so that you can repeat the annotation. It's extremely confusing.
Let's say that again.
And so you have an example at the bottom. Let's say we have this magic annotation that lets you export a value object in different formats. Before, you would have to create a single annotation that would take an array of formats or something like that, and now you can just have several instances of the annotation. One of the reasons why it's not backward compatible is because it requires new reflection API, so you can inspect the repeated annotations, so it wouldn't be very useful on previous versions of the platform.
If you want more information on all of the language stuff, as well as the runtime, the AOT stuff, and JIT stuff, we have podcast with a couple of folks from the art team that was just pushed about an hour ago. So
How convenient.
Android developers backstage, a little plug for the podcast, but basically we're talking to Anwar and Brian, the people that actually work on this stuff and know this stuff deeply, so it's worth listening to if you care about this stuff.
And maybe everything I said is wrong, so go listen to the podcast just in case. Audio latency. So in the previous releases of Android, we did a lot of work to improve audio latency, but all that work was in the native layers. And there was still work to be done in the Java layer of audio. So the good news is that in N, with Audio Track, there are new APIs that let you do low latency. And according to the media team, you can expect a 40 to 70 milliseconds of latency reduction, which is huge when it comes to audio. So this is the way you use it when you create the audio attributes to create your track. You have to set the flag to request the low latency. And to help you deal with latency latency and that might happen while you're playing the audio, we also have two new types of API on Audio Track. So first of all, you can dynamically resize the Audio Track buffers on the fly. And you can also query how many times you had underruns. So the way it works is like while you're doing your playback, from time to time you query the number of underruns. And if you see more than a couple of underruns, then you can resize your buffers, make them bigger to avoid them in the future. Renderscript, a lot of very interesting changes. So now in a single source file, you can have many kernels, so you can have many entry points, and you can launch kernels from other kernels. This is particularly useful to create complex user-facing features. So we have a sample code that's in AOSP. So if you ever use the healing brush in Photoshop or your favorite photo editing tool, so this is what that sample does. It implements a healing brush, and it does call into, like, I think, half a dozen of kernels from a Renderscript kernel. We also can do reduction kernels. Before, our Renderscript kernel was about doing one-to-one mapping. So let's say you have an input pixel, and you had to output the same number of pixels. So now you can do reduce algorithms like histogram, for instance. You can access multiple image buffers from streams. Get byte buffer on allocation is really useful to reduce the number of copies that you make. If you take an image from the camera stream and you want to filter it and then display it on screen, before you had to do multiple copies, which was slowing everything down, that's gone. And we have much better support for FP16, so half floats, that application developers will never care about. I mean, application developers who do not use Renderscript, that is. OpenGL ES 3.2, this one is pretty amazing. I was looking at the release notes of OpenGL ES 3.2 just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And the spec is basically, it's OpenGL ES 3.1 plus the Android extension pack that we already had available on previous versions of Android. So all it does is that it makes that extension pack mandatory. So you will get things like tessellation shaders, geometry shaders, advanced blending equations. So all the blending modes that you find in Photoshop and other image drawing tools are now hardware accelerated. They are available in OpenGL ES. You don't have to write your custom shaders. We have a new texture compression format called ASTC. It's a really, really, really good compression format. So if you can use it, go use it. And finally, something that was sorely needed before, floating point frame buffers. There's also, so Vulkan, how many of you have heard about Vulkan? Okay, how many of you care about Vulkan? Wow, that hurts. So Vulkan is really cool because it's a low-level graphics API. There's still a driver, it still abstracts the GPU for you. But basically the application becomes the OpenGL driver. So you have to do a lot of work yourself, like allocations and synchronization and all those things. But it gives you, it helps you reduce the overhead. So when you call into OpenGL does a lot of error checking for you, and like I said, synchronization and things like that, that most of the time you know already what you're doing and the driver is doing extra work for you on your behalf. So using Vulkan, you can cut down on this overhead. So it doesn't have global state, you can compile the shaders offline, there's a new intermediate format for shaders, binary format, which means you can use any programming language you want to write shaders because you compile them offline, so you do not have to use GLSL, which is fantastic news. It's not available in the first preview. It should be available in the future preview.
So this is like a preview of the preview.
Yeah, it's a preview of the preview. But take a look at it. Go look at Hello Worlds for Vulkan online. And if you don't run away scared for your life, you should probably use it. Otherwise, don't use it. ADB shell, a lot of really cool improvements to ADB shell. Those are minor things, but they make everybody's life a little easier, especially for build systems and automation. For instance, when you start a process with ADB shell, when the process exits on the device, ADB shell will return the error code on the host. Extremely useful for automated testing. Pass through std in. You can. So here, this is a stupid example where I cat a file from my host to a process on the device. Also extremely useful for testing. And we've done a lot of improvements to some of the built-in commands, like ls and stuff like that.
Performance improvements as well.
Performance improvements.
Yeah,
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's actually a good point. File copies are a lot faster now with ADB. All they did, I think, was change the size of a buffer that was used to read files
and removed a couple of sleeps.
Well, it turns out that when you're yeah, but it turns out when you write a utility for phones, for like 2006, and you never change the size of the buffers, they don't really work anymore for current phones.
No one will ever need more than 64K.
Yeah. Also, to be fair, the source code of ADB can be a little scary. It used to have a recursive main. I think it was written by a kernel engineer. So new developer options, if you go in settings, developer options, there's a little more than that, but those are some of the important ones. HDCP checking, so you can disable DRM checking if you want to use the HDMI output, which is fantastic if you want to demo your application at a conference and you don't want to go through one of those crappy cameras, overhead cameras. You can finally start using HDMI output now. You can force all the activities to be resizable, which is bad news for you as developers. It's great news for you as users. It's also a good way for you to test your application quickly without having to change your manifest and see what breaks. For some reason, you can make the web view be multi-process. So if you use a web view in your app and you enable that, then your app's going to have more processes, take more space, but I guess it's safer or faster or something. That's what the web developers tell me, so I believe them. And you can convert to file encryption. So this is what we talked about. If you want to test direct boot, you need to turn that on. So we also worked on, and I think PY somewhere around here will love that, for leak canary. Yeah, right here. He's probably the only person who's going to care about that. So now the heap dumps will include the full stack traces if you enable allocation tracking at the same time, which means that our reporting tools will be able to show you for every object that's in memory in your application, they will be able to tell you where the object came from. So when you have a leak that leak canary can detect, it will tell you not only that you have a leak, but where did you create that object.
So we basically just wanted to make it easier for PY to write the next version.
Pretty much, yeah.
All right.
It's called outsourcing. We also have native allocation tracking, but it requires an internal API. It's not. You'll see that in the heap dumps. It's not very useful for you guys right now. And we have internally a tool called A-hat, which is a variant of hat and J-hat that uses those new features. It's not publicly available yet. I asked the author if he's going to open source it. He says that they'll think about it.
But there are other. So we mentioned leak canary. There's also leak tools in Android Studio in the last couple of releases.
Yeah, but so to be clear, right, as of today, you cannot do anything with that information because there's no tool out there that's using it.
But isn't it cool?
But there might be. ICU for J. So ICU is a library that's useful for Unicode and globalization support. It's now part of the Android framework. So to avoid conflicts with the external library, we changed the package name, so it's called android.icu and not com.ibm.icu. And the reason for that is ICU is a huge library because it has big data sets. And so if you were to use it in your application, it's going to make your APK grow a lot bigger. So now you could have two versions of your APK. For N and above, you can use the platform's ICU, and for previous versions, you can bring your own ICU with you. It's not the full ICU, so like we mentioned here, deprecated and unstable APIs of ICU are not part of our version. And if you do a lot of custom text layout, you might be interested. It's basically better replacement for existing Android APIs. So an example here, java.text.break iterator that tells you like where you can break words. The ICU version will do a much better job. A lot of good news on the NDK front. So we have GCC 4.9. It's going to be the last version of GCC we're going to put in the NDK. GCC is deprecated. We're moving to Clang, so Clang 3.8. So stop using GCC. Like as of this preview, it still works, but test with Clang instead. And now the default architecture for ARM toolchain is ARM 7, which should improve a lot the performance and size of your binaries.
So if you're fans of the support library, in the end preview version of the support library, there's really not that big a change that you're interested in. It's mostly bug fixes and app compat support for some of the new preview APIs. But to go over some of the more interesting stuff that's been in recent releases, so in 23.2, you had night mode, the ability to then switch between the material light and dark themes in your application. Bottom sheets, new material UI thing that we came out with in the design library.
When you say bottom sheets, a picture of a hotel room for some reason. You're bad at naming.
Okay. Moving on, vector drawable. People have been asking this for a long time. They kept asking for it while it was in development. They were like, what we really need is vector drawable in support library. And be like, yes, we understand. Okay, so now it's finally there. So please go use it. So you have the ability to develop these resources and use them on older versions. As we said, some of the performance improvements are specific to N, but the functionality should work everywhere in similar ways. And recycler view, people were asking for wrap content, or what we now call auto measure capabilities. So that's in 23.2 as well. In 23.1, we had changes to change animation, so much more full-featured way to animate changes to items when the content inside the item was changing, as opposed to just items being added and removed.
A couple of security improvements. So we now have, thanks to the trusted execution environment on the system on a chip, we have a hardware-backed key store. So it's nice because everything you store in that key store is not accessible by the kernel or the Android framework. So if there were to be a security issue in those parts of the system, normally the attacker should not be able to access that key store. We also have a declarative way to do security configuration for networking, so it's less error-prone than basically the Java API versions. So this is an example. In your manifest, there's a new metadata where you can link to a network configuration. And at the bottom, you can see an example where we say use clear text traffic equals false. That means that you want to forbid the use of HTTP in your application, and you mandate HTTPS. And you should go read the documentation. You can do a lot of very interesting things with that. You can configure everything by domain. You can exclude domain and include domains.
When we created this presentation, I incorrectly thought that we wouldn't start a half hour late, and I thought that we would have time for questions and answers. So this slide stands for...
To be fair, we never have time for Q&A, but this time it's not our fault.
Q&A stands for quickly and accurately. The most important thing to take away from this presentation would be that you should go out and download the bits if you have not already. So there's a site on d.android.com you can go to. It's pretty obvious once you get there. Various sub-sites in there. Some of the more important ones are learning about what the preview is, overviews of the APIs, the behavior changes, full reference for the API surface. You can actually get this thing and run the bits on your device, develop applications for it, and most importantly, report issues that you have. That is the entire reason that we have the preview, so that you have advance notice of the changes that are coming, and if there are problems with your application that you need us to know about, now would be a really good time to let us know.
And a quick note, the API documentation is not part of the SDK download. It's a separate download. You can find it on the website, and the N preview APIs are not available online yet, I mean, directly from your web browser. So just go find that zip file somewhere on the website.
Yep. And finally, the end. That's it. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.